Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Christian.
I'm Tommy. And why do they refer to a Mickey Mouse operation in a negative way?
Oh, interesting.
Like if something is like chaotic and it's not working well, and you're like, this is such a Mickey Mouse operation. When to me, the great irony in that, at least financially speaking, like a Mickey Mouse operation, it's worked pretty well.
I'm not a financials guy, but I think Mickey Mouse is doing okay for himself. It's
That's
by
that's
no
what I
means a
mean.
financial problem. I've I've never seen the original Mickey Mouse shows.
Neither have I.
I've
I'm
seen
sure
like
the I'm
bits and clips.
and I'm sure we could have Googled this, or I could have Googled it, but it made it way more fun just to randomly open this up on the show rather than go to Google for a logical answer.
My gut tells me Mickey had to be a bit of a gong show. Like I feel like there's no way in like the original cartoons and like the comics and things like that came out like way back in the day. I'm sure Mickey messed with all kinds of crap. There's no way he's
So is it
organized and did things well.
yeah, so is it referring more to like Mickey being a clown?
I
Like
think so.
he's a foolish character. So if this is a Mickey Mouse operation, it's like, or there's even like you've done a Mickey Mouse job on this. Like if you're, looking around a house and you see like a reno done or, like a home repair job on someone's automobile, you're like, yeah, that was a Mickey Mouse job.
Yeah, things are everywhere. Nothing's clean and like done perfectly. It's always just kind of there's a little bit here, a little bit there. This is kind of off. That's sort of off. It's got to be something more along those lines.
Yeah, because like I said, like when I think Mickey Mouse, I think Disney. And when you think Disney, morals aside of and ethics, because I'm sure if you want to make billions and billions of dollars, you have to do some immoral and unethical things to step on people along the way. But financially speaking, like that is a that is an empire, both in terms of the
Uh,
real estate they own all around the world, the parks,
yeah, the
now
cruise
Disney
ships,
Plus is a
the
thing. Like, yeah, that is it's a financial empire, which if it was run in a really poor and disastrous way would have never became what it was.
no.
So that's why I find it odd that, the phrase of, oh, that's, you know, you're doing whatever, organizing something, you're going, oh, this is such a Mickey Mouse operation.
Yeah, it must refer directly to the cartoon itself. Cause yeah, like I've been to Disney. They're not strapped on cash. Like they're doing okay.
No, and I mean, I've been to Orlando. You lived in Orlando for
Yeah.
4 months. I mean, if there's anywhere in the world where, you want to see the influence of the mouse, I
Oh,
mean,
it's everywhere. Everywhere.
they own the state of Florida.
Dude, practically, man. Like it is half the city is Disney. It's nuts how huge that place is. And you can see it from almost anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's why I found it odd, like that, a Mickey Mouse operation is, seen negatively because to me, if you wanted to run something and it was, a Mickey Mouse operation, it, at least financially speaking, may turn out to be very lucrative.
Yeah, if you're doing the right kind of operation, yeah. So Mickey himself must have been a bit of a disaster then I'm imagining in the cartoons. He must have been.
I wonder if I'll have to look it up after, but I wonder if Google has an answer for that, like where that came from. Because I think you're right. It must come from maybe like he's a foolish character, or I don't know. I don't even know what like the plot or the premise of Mickey Mouse is. Like, what is the story of Mickey Mouse? What is the plot? I have no idea. Like, maybe he's like the cartoon version of the Trailer Park Boys, and everything he tries to do is just like a disaster. So then it's like, yeah, this is a Mickey Mouse operation because in his day in and day out life, everything he does doesn't work out. Like, I
Mickey
don't
can't put
know.
his socks on without something going wrong. Like
Yeah, like I don't know.
like getting those white gloves on is a miracle in and of itself, let alone trying to fix anything.
Well, and that's what I mean. So I don't know what the plot or the premise is, so I don't know. Like maybe it stems from that. Like I imagine you're right. It has to be something related to that because it can't refer to the overall corporation or the brand because they're too successful, quote unquote, to like have that connotation attached.
Yeah, because every reference I'm thinking of like a Mickey show, it's always pretty out there. Like things always go wrong or like doesn't always work out. Like that's the kind of classic trope of like, oh yeah, we're gonna run into a problem and like we're gonna do a weird job of trying to fix it and I'll figure it out itself somehow. Like that's always
Yeah. So yeah, I was just curious to get your take on that because I heard that the other day and I'm like, yeah, it's funny it's used in a negative context,
yeah. Where does that come
even
from?
though
Mickey must have been an absolute goof. There's no other way.
yeah, he must have been a dumpster fire. Like just like everything he touches is just like a problem.
Like he's the friend that everyone has that always breaks every dish or will crash their car in some crazy way. It's like, dude, you broke your car again. Or
Yeah,
like,
he
how'd you
can't
break
catch a
your
break.
foot? Yeah.
He can't catch a break. Through his own doing or not. But yeah, that's so I was just curious to get your take on it. But I hadn't actually thought about I was so fixated, I think, on associating Mickey with the overall brand. I didn't actually take the time to think about like Mickey Mouse, the character himself.
Yeah, because Mickey Mouse himself didn't invent Disney.
No, Disney invented. He was the puppet. He was the scapegoat for every time something went wrong.
Yes. Yeah, it was always played by
Deflected
Mickey.
deflect Disney, put all the blame on Mickey.
Dude, maybe that's where it came from. Disney would do something messed up and something would go wrong, and they'd be like, guys, we can't control Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, it was all
Like,
Mickey's fault. He was just the ultimate scapegoat, the fall guy for everything.
I just know that yeah, like Mickey's always the front of some sort of controversy. Always.
Oh,
Like,
I
think of all
like
the
that
lawsuits
answer.
over Mickey Mouse.
Have there been? I
Oh, so
imagine,
many.
like, I'm sure Disney's been involved in lawsuits, but like, are these the equivalent of like Florida Man lawsuits, where it's just like absurd things that you can't. It's so wacky you can't even make it up.
Oh, for sure. We'll talk about it at the end because my song is related to this coincidentally. So it's funny that you made
Oh,
it a Mickey Mouse thing.
okay.
So yeah, we
Yeah.
can
So
talk
now
about it later on.
everyone listening, you have to make it to the end of the show, or you can skip ahead. That's also an option too. But you know, this has worked out well because now
Yeah.
there's the hook,
This is
and
how we
you're
just need
pulling
to plan
people
this a
in.
little better next time.
Yeah, yeah, we got to get rid of the surprise question and use it in advance and
Yeah.
organize it. But I prefer to do a Mickey Mouse job on this and just randomly throw out the question and see what happens.
Yeah. I feel like this podcast is half a Mickey Mouse job. But if they
It
skip to
is.
the end to see the hook, then they would miss the conversation that we're going to have about tendons in this two-part series.
Yeah, and arguably the stuff that actually matters, not the pointless banter in the beginning, just to kind of get things rolling. Because really, you should be listening to this to, you know, get the information or critique the information, whatever you want to do with it, on tendon training and adaptation, and not to hear us bicker back and forth about Mickey Mouse.
And whether or not
We
he was a
can't.
good workman or not.
Yeah, we can't fill an hour doing that. No chance.
I don't know. Knowing us, I feel like we could probably get there at some point.
Practice.
Eventually. The episode's just going to gradually get longer and longer until it's a 1 hour episode about Mickey Mouse.
I don't want to go that direction. I'd rather talk about tendons.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, like you said, we'll talk a little bit about, well, not a little bit about, we'll talk majority about tendons today and a little bit about Mickey Mouse. That is the breakdown of today. And I feel like I say this kind of with a lot of topics when they come up, where it's like I wish I had paid attention to it more. And maybe this is just the natural progression of coaching and learning. And you can't know everything all the time, so you slowly kind of uncover things. But like, did you find that the tendon just kind of gets like forgotten about a little bit? Like we talk about anatomy, we get so fixated on bones and muscles and organs that we tend to not think much about the tendon. I feel like I was saying similar thing when Braden and I did the series on fascia,
Yeah.
where it's like just it historically seems to be forgotten about. So Yeah, I don't know if that's been your experience with the learning, because I mean, if I'm saying now I've been coaching for 10 or 12 years, I've probably only been seriously considering the tendon for like 4 or 5 of it.
Yeah, I will say this about the tendon. I do think for a long period of time, like I wasn't focused on, and when conversations around the tendon would come out, it was always about stretch shortening cycle usages, and it was always talking about like the musculotendinous unit, right? Like it was always something that was a part of the muscle, but the muscle was kind of the thing, and the tendon was just this rubber band that was attached to it. I feel like it was a lot of the conversation around it. But I mean, similar to the conversation we had before we started recording the show of like 90s is new again. I feel like tendons follow the same path, headlined by a lot of guys like Keith Barr, where they're bringing like the tendon, not the muscle tendon together, but like the tendon back to light of like, hey, there's some pretty crazy stuff that happens physiologically, biomechanically, anatomically in terms of the structure and how it responds to stuff within the tendon that makes it a super unique tissue, not just a rubber band that the muscle pulls on.
Yeah, it was almost like the tendon was like that uncool friend. Like it
Yeah.
was always there in association with the muscle, which was like the cool and in thing to talk about. And like you said, it was like we talk about the muscle or we talk about the muscle with the tendon, but we never talk about the tendon.
Yeah. Well, I think
And
similar to
part of
fascia, like people just thought it was a
and
passive inert tissue.
yeah, but there's more going on than that. And I mean, part of this could be as well, like if you look at the timeline, at least for me in my coaching, when did I start paying more attention to tendons? When did I start worrying about that more? It's when I got kind of down the track and field rabbit hole where my world of coaching was very much a blend of S&C and track and field coming together. When I was more living just in the pure strength coach world, eh, I think maybe there's a fixation there in the culture of strength conditioning that, like you said, it's passive. We train the muscles, we train the movements, and the tendons adapt and do whatever they need to do based on that. I don't know if that's maybe an influence of it as well, because when I started diving into track and field literature and readings and info from coaches, tendons, like it's everywhere. So I'm wondering maybe if I'd started in the world of track and field, if the tendons would have been something that was taken along from day one, and maybe it was the path of S&C that got me to fixate more on some of these other things and kind of have the tendon take a back seat.
Well, I definitely think in S&C we do over fixate on muscle. Like that's just a trend that the industry has because it's very much like big muscle, strong muscle, fast muscle. Like that's sort of a lot of the classic sort of thought process that like you're taught in your undergrad, for
Yeah,
example.
force is everything.
Yeah, get bigger, faster, stronger. We're always too weak, and force is the king. Like that's the conversation. The tendon brings in that nuance of like someone could be super weak, weak in quotations, but they get really bouncy and elastic. Like that's where you see like an Andre DeGrasse type runner who's just like pop, 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 pop along the ground, and you're like, holy crap! Like he's a tiny human. Like he's not a big guy, incredibly fast. Versus like a Marcel Jacobs, who's this giant Italian muscle-bound monster.
Yeah, and I think that's where like, the phrase like when someone's like wired. I know that
Yeah,
has a lot to do with the CNS as well, but I think the great kind of wired CNS movers, they rely more on the tendons and the
yeah,
the passive energy storage and release than they do on like muscle bound, muscle driven activities. Because I mean, the reason why I started looking at the tendons and caring about the tendons is because they store and release energy
yeah.
and thus force and watts and power and whatever into the ground and into the movements substantially faster than muscles. So now that I'm living in this world of track and field where it doesn't matter the event, velocity is the key. You want to throw
Yeah.
farther, throw faster. You want to jump farther, take off with higher speeds. You want to run faster, it's all velocity driven. And if you're in a velocity driven environment, I think you have to be more fixated on the tendons and the
Yeah.
elastic structures in the body rather than the muscles. So I think for me personally, that's really been the driver of
Yeah.
going down the rabbit hole of exploring the tendons and what are things we can do in training to create those adaptations. And if you want to create those adaptations, you have to kind of take a step back and understand the structure, the anatomy, the makeup, and the function of these tendons on how to best train them in a practical sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Can like we've talked about this before, but like especially in track and field where like everything is almost elastic in nature, especially when you're looking at the track events and the jump events. Throws obviously not as much, but there's components in there. But when you got ground contact times of 0.07 milliseconds at the fast end, up to 0.13, 0.12 for people who maybe a little bit more of a push driven athlete, that's still incredibly fast. And like muscle just doesn't contract that fast. And that's where we start getting conversations around like how does the muscle and tendon actually function together in these really dynamic, fast, explosive movements. Then what's that role of that tendon as? It's kind of like the gateway between the muscle producing force and the bone actually moving joints.
And it's interesting you bring up the ground contact time, because if you think in a traditional strength and conditioning context of ground reaction time and fast force application, the threshold tends to be, it's got to be below zero point 0.3 seconds. That's like
Yeah,
a rapid activity. And the slowest event on average in track and field for force application is high jump at around
yeah,
zero point 0.2.
yeah,
So even the slowest thing, and I use like slowest in quotations because in reality it's not slow at all, but the slowest event in force application in track and field or athletics is substantially faster than what's considered the threshold of very rapid force application. Because when you look at other
yeah.
sports, you spend way more time on the ground. So at least for me, that's kind of been the uh, yeah, like the driver, the influence to look at tendons, because tendons are faster than muscles. And so if I'm trying to
Yeah.
create speed and velocity, I'm probably going to pay more attention to what I need to do with the tendons than I am the muscles, because I'm going to get more velocity out of the tendons.
You're gonna get more velocity out of the tendons. You're gonna get more efficiency out of the tendons, right? Because it's not active contraction.
Correct.
It's passive in the sense it's not using energy to produce high amounts of force. When you think of like a slingshot as a little kid, the pullback force, like the force using to stretch the slingshot, is way
Yeah.
less than the force that the slingshot shoots that little rock or that marble out. And
Yeah.
tendons serve that similar function, right? Especially when we're looking at tissues like the Achilles and the patellar tendon for jumping and sprinting and things like that.
Well, exactly. And if you look at sort of the structural makeup of tendons, they're, fibrous, elastic, collagen based, um, structures that, like you said, have no metabolic
Yeah,
um, function or structures within them. They depend on the muscle metabolically to create movement and preload, or some sort of outside force from the body. If you had flight time and then you're coming down into the ground, it's
yeah,
depending on external forces or external metabolic activity to create movement, to load and take advantage of the collagen fibers, the elastic fibers, the fibrous structures that can actually stretch and load much better than the muscles are capable of doing.
well, not every tendon is also built the same in that sense too, like in terms of how stiff the tendons are.
Yes.
Like the tendon isn't just like it's not just a block of tendon that's all the same, and then the muscle that attached to the tendon. Tendon almost has like this interesting transitional piece to it, where at the bone it's super stiff, really dense. And as it gets closer and closer to the muscle tissue, it slowly gets a little bit less stiff. It gets a little bit more compliant as it starts to interact with the muscle that connects to it. So you get this like gradient of stiffness along the line of the tendon.
Yeah, and it's great that you bring that up, because there's also um, the idea that one of the review studies I looked at, the from Franchi or however the Italians would pronounce it, from 2007, they were looking at some of the structure
Yeah,
of the tendon and how that influences the function. No different than muscles. You have muscles in series and
yeah,
parallel, and based on how they're architecturally put together, they perform better or worse with certain functions. And so when you look at the tendons, they feature that same thing. The tendons in the hamstring, or the gastroc and soleus with the Achilles tendon, long, very stretchy, fibrous, or sorry, like very stretchy, elastic type tendons, where, like you said, there's probably a little bit closer to the proximal end of that, where it's very stiff to attach to the bone, but then you get a long, thin tendon
Yeah.
that's very elastic, very good at dealing with high velocities, versus something that's like a shorter, thicker tendon, like the patellar tendon, which is probably much better at dealing with, higher forces in terms of stability and not yielding and giving way.
Yeah.
So again, that, uh, that to me is a big link on, when we get to the next episode, or the next part where we talk about the actual training function. This is where I think, as an example of why it's important to understand the makeup of the tendon, because then you may end up training the muscle that connects to the patellar tendon
Yeah.
differently than the muscle that connects to the one of the three heads of the hamstring or the Achilles tendon, because the function of that tendon is going to be different based on its actual architectural makeup.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how influenceable that makeup is, right? So like when we talk about kind of like main composition of the tendon, like it's primarily collagen, like you said, and it's generally uniform. Like it wants to go in the same direction. It's
Yeah.
not kind of random and scattered. It's almost kind of like a railroad where it wants to go in that same direction to give it sort of a uniform pull. And you get the cross links that are sort of scattered throughout. And then obviously, like we've talked about, like tendon stiffness is a really important piece. So the thicker that tendon gets, and the more cross links we get within that, the thicker, or not, sorry, the stiffer the tendon
Yeah.
tends to get. And depending on what we do, we can influence and create more cross links that will influence the stiffness of the tendon in a positive way. So we'll get more stiff, or we can get rid of cross links, which will make a tendon less stiff. And depending on which region, yeah, patellar, Achilles, wherever it is, we may want more or less cross links, or depending on injury, we may want to influence how many cross links are in the tendon and things like that. So it's the amount of, say, influence we have over the composition of the tendon is actually a lot more than I think people thought. We just thought like, oh, you have a stiff tendon or not stiff tendon, but there's actually a lot of influence that we can have on that tendon structure itself.
Yeah. And kind of going back with that traditional S&C approach, it was always about stiff tendon, good tendon,
Yeah,
stiff tendon, good tendon, lots of force. When there's really, there's a balance of, the tendon needs to be compliant enough to
yeah,
move and stretch and store, but it also needs to be able to handle the stiffness of transmitting the force. There's this balance, and you're talking about the cross links help add stability, building things in series help add the what's it called, like the fluid movement of it. But there's also that crimping structure, or it's almost like
yes,
coiled, and so they're coiled but in line with the action, and that coiling kind of structure of the collagen allows for
yeah,
a bit of that loading and unloading. Almost, I don't think they're spring shapes, but if you think of a spring, the way it coils, a spring that isn't coiled isn't going to function like a spring,
yeah,
right? The shape inherently helps give it that behavior. And so that's another thing. Like when you start diving into the tendons, and you're like, okay, yeah, like you said, there's these cross links, there's things moving in series, there's that crimping structure. And if we want to build a tendon that, is geared toward sport performance, we probably want to develop a tendon that, like you said, is working in line or in series with the flow or the line of action that we want. And
yeah.
we probably want to preserve that crimping structure, which appears to be pretty important for the loading and unloading.
Well, and that's where you've seen a lot of tendinopathy stuff start to pop up, is you get this nice uniform crimp structure. And as soon as tendon tissue starts to break down and become less uniform, the tendons can't slide and crimp and uncoil and recoil like they normally would in a healthy tendon, right? And that's where you start seeing some like the patellofemoral stuff, or tendinopathy of the Achilles, especially, where it's constant impact, high volumes, high force, If you think about all the explosive dynamic things, it's usually like patellar tendon, Achilles tendon, the big two typically we see.
Yeah, and I mean, and it makes me wonder. So one of the things that I had got when I was reading some of these papers, when we go back to sort of the structure, whether they're long, thinner tendons or shorter, thicker tendons, and it's funny you brought up patellar and Achilles. At least, again, I think coming primarily from the track and field and working prior with sports where there's more open field running, I would have said the two biggest tendon things I deal with are the tendons in the hamstring group and the Achilles
Mm,
tendon. And I almost wonder, are those thinner, longer tendons because they deal with they're dependent on that stretch, in a lot of these sprinting type activities and high force, high velocity movements, are those thinner, longer tendons more at risk of injury and overload because of their structure and their shape and the speeds at which they're exposed to? But like you said, from an injury standpoint, if your Achilles or your hamstring tendons aren't functioning well, you probably see a lot of cross links. You probably see a lot of
yeah.
maybe deformity in that crimping, which doesn't allow the tendon to slide and move with the velocity
Yeah.
that it needs when you're moving at high speeds, and then that's where you end up overloading the tendon and having injury.
Well, and this is interesting that you kind of mentioned like the high speeds of what's hitting. So there was a presentation by Keith Barr. It was for the whole Copson network that he did it for. And he was talking about high rate versus low rates on the tendon, because tendon, like the viscoelastic properties of the tendon, means the tendon responds differently depending on the nature of the strain. So the tendon to a high strain movement will respond differently and act differently than a low strain movement. And he was talking about if you get sort of your outer tissues, like your outer fibers of the collagen, and then you get your middle fibers, like during really high strain movements, what happens is the outside chunks of the tendon compress the middle bits of the tendon, and that's what can start creating like that breakdown and the deformation of the collagen fibers in the center of the tendon. And you hear some people like Jake Tour talk about where it's like, oh, like you start getting like this donut effect where you almost get like a hole of inert tendon tissue in the middle of the tendon
Mhm.
because of after enough like high dynamic jumping or sprinting or whatever it is, you just get this compression over and over and over again that breaks down that central tendon tissue. And then you start getting some of this the shielding where now you're starting to rely more and more on the outside tissues of the tendon versus central tissues of the tendon.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up. I don't know if you maybe know, but there's like I think there's what, 5 or 6 types of collagen that are comprised
Yes.
in the tendon. Because if you look up, like for example, type 1 collagen is like the primary load bearer
Hmm.
within the tendon. So type 1 collagen is, a little stiffer, more resilient. And then I think as you move down or up the numbers or whatever,
Okay.
the collagen becomes more elastic. So like you're saying here, a type 1 collagen will behave differently than like a type 5 collagen or a type 4. I don't know the in-depth, where is located
Yeah.
what. But it's interesting you bring that up because that to me sounds a little bit like that. Like there's different types of collagens, there's different types of properties within the tendon itself. Like
Yeah.
you said, it's not just all the same um, like makeup throughout.
Yeah.
There's
When you
different
can
types of
see,
collagen serving different functions.
yeah, when you see that in some of the crosslink stuff as well. So there's two different types of crosslinks that we can see. Like enzymatic ones is the main ones that you notice, where it's like regular healthy human training, doing lots of dynamic movements. You're gonna get lots of enzymatic crosslinks, which will contribute to more tendon stiffness. But it was interesting that again, another thing I learned from Barr was he was talking about diabetic crosslinks as well. So you can actually get sugar crosslinks. So he was saying that anybody with diabetes could potentially get lots of sugar crosslinks within the tendon as well. So it almost artificially creates a really stiff tendon, but
Yeah,
not in a
like
way
blockage for
that,
the sliding.
yeah, well, it doesn't necessarily block the sliding, but it increases the stiffness of the sliding. Like, because a crossing step piece is going to make the tendon be more of a rigid
Yeah, so it
elastic.
ramps
So it
up
can
the
be
resistance.
beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it can be beneficial, but like the artificial creating of the cross links makes a stiffer tendon than what you've trained for essentially. And then you start getting the conversations around the relationship between the tendon stiffness and the muscle stiffness. Because really the muscle is like, we're going to use the analogy of the kid pulling back the slingshot. Imagine you're 5 years old, you just got this new slingshot, but the band on the slingshot's so stiff that you can't actually pull it back to shoot your marble.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of idea. So if you get too many of these crosslinks, the muscle's no longer able to stretch the tendon. And then you start getting predisposed to like muscle strains. Because when you're making like ground contact, the tendon isn't stretching anymore. The muscle's actually stretching. And that's where you start getting like strains and pulls and things like that. So it's an interesting piece to consider, as well as what's the tendon stiffness relative to the muscle stiffness as well, the strength of the muscle.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the slingshot example because if I think of slingshot, I would think of the elastic band as the tendon and the actual slingshot handle as the muscle. And in order for a tendon to, be able to move and be elastic, there needs to be enough stiffness in the muscle,
Yeah.
or in this case, the frame of the slingshot. If that slingshot was like a wet noodle,
Oh, we
you
can
go to
pull it
pull
back.
back on the elastic, and then the handle or the structure just comes back with it, and you don't actually you need something solid to
Rebound on.
maintain to rebound off of. And I think in the case of the body, you're better off to have the stiffness created from the muscle holding the position and then free flowing, letting the tendon to do the work, rather than what you've described, where it's like, yeah, the tendon becomes so stiff, the muscle is now your compliant tissue, and it's
Yeah.
probably not designed to do that. Certainly at some of the velocities at which throwing, jumping, sprinting occur at, and that's where you get, oh yeah, muscle belly pull, because the tendon maybe wasn't
Yeah.
compliant enough to help out with that high velocity work.
Well, and that's where you see the conversation around muscle functioning kind of like quasi isometrically now. Because I think classically it's taught where when you do apply it like stretch shortening cycle, you land from a plyo. Okay, the muscle stretches and then it
Yeah,
holds isometrically and then it rebounds. I think things are changing a little bit in terms of how I think of the stretch shortening cycle, where it's almost like you land, the muscle gets a little bit of deformation, but it's almost isometric, because that
yeah.
isometric muscle is what allows the tendon to just be elasticy and reboundy and get that stretch reflex that we want.
And the other thing too that kind of relates, I think, to this was one of these papers with, can't remember if it was just Kubo or if it was Kubo et al., like with colleagues or whatever, but that the tendon stress, or the stress you put on the tendon, is not a linear
You know,
function, in the sense of, oh, if the muscle stress is one, the tendon stress is one, and then the muscle stress is two, and the tendon stress is two, and it follows this nice linear pathway. There is a tremendous amount of force that's required to deform and get the tendon moving.
yeah,
But then it kind of like levels off. So the relationship between the muscle stress and the tendon stress is not a linear function, which I think is important to recognize, because there might be the thought process that, okay, if I have low stress muscle activities or low force activities, that inherently is going to have low tendon stress,
yeah,
right? And I'll use like walking as the example. We think of walking as a relatively gentle activity, not a lot of stress on the muscle, but even walking, you put like 2.5, or I forget the exact, Bosch talks about it in his book, but there's like 2 to 3
yeah,
times body weight stress going through the Achilles tendon. Because again, just to get the tendon stretching and moving, it creates a lot of deformity and a lot of stress. And so I think from an injury perspective, or even from a performance, just understanding how the tendon works, is that, yeah, high or low muscle force doesn't necessarily indicate the stress you're placing on the tendon.
yeah. Yeah, and then the nature of that force changes how the tendon interacts, right? So we kind of talked a bit about the high strain stuff, where it's you get a lot more of the cross links with the really quick contraction of the tendon. But then if you do the opposite, where it's, hey, we're going to do some really slow contractions. And this is where you see some of the isometric stuff. We'll get into more detail um, in the part 2, but you get the tendon creep phenomenon, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
So like, and it's similar to like how we talked about how stretch shortening say, well, it doesn't really function how you're taught in your undergrad. Same thing with isometric actions, where it's like, let's say you're doing a wall sit. It's not everything not moving, but it's as you're holding the wall sit, you get a really high force on the tendon as you first go down. And then as you hold that, the muscle actually slowly shortens and the
Yeah.
tendon slowly lengthens versus everything being still. And that's what causes some of the breakdown of cross links and
Yeah.
stimulates the regenesis of collagen tissue, where it's like, hey, now you're out with an injury. Now we can regenerate some of the collagen to that really slow hold breakdown and realigning of that collagen. So it's a
And that
cool nature the tendon has to do that.
and that creep theory is, I think, really important. It made a lot of sense to me when I started rethinking about, like you said, an isometric movement. I'll
Yeah.
stick with the wall sit because that's the example you've used. Yeah, we classically think everything is stagnant, nothing is changing because the position isn't changing. Okay, the
Yeah.
position isn't changing, the joint angle may not be changing, your bone length certainly isn't changing,
Yeah.
but everything else that connects all of that is in this constant state of, like you said, the muscle starts to, fatigue or need to work harder, it starts contracting more, the tendon starts to length, the segment length hasn't changed.
Yeah.
If your femur is 2 feet long in a wall sit, whether you're 30 seconds in or 2 minutes in, your femur will remain 2 feet long. But what percentage of tendon and muscle is making up that, length is going to be different 15 seconds in than it is 2 minutes in. The length of the muscle will change, the length of the tendon will change. And I think that was a big moment for me when I was kind of reading about that stuff, because then it's like, yeah, we tend to look at the isometric movements from like a global perspective and we
Yeah.
go, oh, segments aren't moving, segments aren't changing, but all the little stuff that comprises within those segments are constantly changing to adapt to, the fatigue or the stress or other things like that. And like you said, that breakdown is really crucial, because the Zabriskie paper was looking a little bit at that, about just like any training, you have a degree of stress, and
Yeah.
every training we view as positive stress. So if we put stress on the tendon via exercise, there's going to be a degree of breakdown or damage that we
Yeah.
that we do. And like you said, possibly with isometrics, if you're stretching the tendon, or like you said, you're getting that creep deformation phenomenon. But the exercise has a net positive benefit because the collagen synthesis response
Yeah.
is greater from exercise than the degree of breakdown. So net gain from exercise effectively, from that type of stuff. So, and I think that plays in nicely to what you talked about, that there is the exercise and stress on the tendon can be used to build up the
Yeah.
tendon or get the tendon to function in a desired way based on how you're stressing it.
Yeah. Well, it can influence a lot too. Like, and that's what we talked about is it's not just, hey, this is what it does. There's a nuance, and this is why these conversations of like what's actually going on are so important, because that influences what the training you do creates at the adaptation level to each specific tissue, which is such an important like missed piece, because people just say like, oh, do this and you get whatever, but you miss some of the like, hey, if you do this, these are some of the signaling components that happen. And that's something I do find interesting is the adaptability of tendons are really high. So have you seen any of this stuff on like the signaling rates of tendon?
No.
So I can't remember whatever I think it's growth factor beta or whatever the main
One of
signaling is
the
for collagen resynthesis.
Okay.
Um, After about 10 to 15 minutes of activity, like slow contraction activity, so like isometrics or eccentric work, is when it peaks. So that's when you're getting the highest amount of growth, like signaling to resynthesize collagen, things like that in the tendon. So you only have to do kind of isometric eccentric activity for 10 to 15 minutes to get the most signaling. But the refractory rate of that is actually relatively quickly. So within 6 hours, you're sensitive to doing that signal again. So if I want to maximize how much collagen resynthesis is happening within the tendon, let's roughly call it you're up for 18 hours, you're sleeping for 6 to 8. You could do like 3 times a day and get maximum signaling to that tendon, which is actually pretty crazy about tendon because not many structures like muscle, you can't signal muscle 3 times a day through like heavy loaded training
No.
to adapt and create change in the tendon.
Well, and I imagine there's some degree with the tendon as well. You're kind of giving me flashbacks of anatomy trains and stuff from Tom Myers and some of the research that's been done in the fascial world, where there are a number of different time frames for adaptations or changes. There are changes with the fascia and the structure that take place almost instantly as you're moving.
Yeah.
Where if I stand up versus sit down in a chair, there are instantaneous changes that take place in order for me to accommodate for the change in space and pressure and how the fascia needs to sit with the rest of the structures in the body in order to make those positions happen. And then you have adaptations that take weeks or months to either get into place or have the reverse happen where you lose the adaptation. So I imagine with the tendon as well, given its heavy links with fascia, that there are probably some very rapid changes and responses you can get in the tendon
Yeah.
in the short term, and there's probably some other changes that long term you have to attack a little bit more consistently in order to see those changes.
Yeah, and you see some of that stuff from Jill Cook and Barr and a couple of those folks as well. One
Yeah.
of the interesting ones I thought as I read the Jill Cook paper on like cortical dysinhibition because of tendinopathies and talking about like
Mhm.
how the nervous system will stop producing as much force to like the tendinopathic side and how that influences force production. And then now you're seeing some of the stuff around like desensitization of the tendon happens almost immediately, where it's say like that tendon creep desensitizes the tendon to pain or desensitizes the nervous system to pain. So then you can go now do high strain, high rate activities with no pain and less neural disinhibition, which is a really cool idea of like, can you imagine having an injury where it's I can do some stuff and then anything that's blocking me from doing it just goes away for that training session, essentially, which is an interesting concept to work around.
Well, and I think that kind of touches nicely on a point here that I have from some of the reading, where we've talked a little bit, I think, or a lot from like a physiological standpoint,
Yeah.
right? The muscle does work, there's metabolic function, and then the tendon is doing, you know, work in conjunction with that. And it's not like the tendon is just a completely uninnervated, like disconnected component of the body. There's a massive neural working within the tendon, and even the idea what you just talked about is similar to a little bit like with the Golgi tendon organs, where they provide a tremendous amount of sensory feedback to what is happening, and if we have the ability to tap into and change and influence some of that sensory feedback, we can then like kind of modulate, like you said, the force that's available. The GTO is a protective mechanism.
Yeah.
It's designed to prevent enough. If it detects there's a lot of force going through the tendon, it wants to shut things down, de-innervate, and not allow the stretch to happen anymore or any more tension to go through the tendon. But in some cases, yeah, from a ecological standpoint, having those mechanisms in place is probably very helpful. From a sport performance or an output standpoint, it's detrimental because it's not allowing us to potentially use all the force and all the capabilities that we have within ourselves. And so it's interesting you bring that up because that I think is another, you're talking about a little bit more on the injury side. Okay, well, can we modulate this nervous system response to create a training session because we're going to be pain
Yeah.
free. But then also, can we, kind of desensitize these Golgi tendon organs to
Yeah.
allow us to unlock performance that
Yeah.
is probably already there. We just can't tap into it because the nervous system is going, no, 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 no. You're not ready for this. And
Yeah.
so
This
I
hurts.
think yeah, or this is too much. And so that's why we have to kind of slowly, we want to ramp up loads. We want to ramp up velocity. We want the body to be comfortable with being like, yeah, that amount of force and that speed, you're good to go. Like
Yeah.
the road is clear. And so I think that's another important understanding to look at the connection with the tendons and the sensory information that it provides to the nervous system because they work very what's the word I'm looking for? Like they work tightly with the nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah, and like even though we haven't necessarily changed the structure of the tendon itself, like you said, like I like the idea of like the words you use of unlocking performance was a good phrase for it because we haven't changed the structure of the tendon within a session, despite doing something. The tendon structure itself is relatively the same in the short term, but like you've said, you've unlocked performance by desensitizing components of the tendon, the nervous system. So that's a very short term, call it adaptation, but short term changes. And then eventually over the course of 2 months, okay, maybe the collagen tissue then becomes less disorganized and doing that every day and starts to realign a lot more, right? Very similar to like growth spurt in adolescence. I know is a really good important one for tendons as well. Because
Mhm.
bone, when you're at peak height velocity, grows so fast. You get so lanky so quick. But the tendons and the muscle take so long to
Catch
elongate
up.
and grow. And that's where you get this really stiff tendon. You get a lot of tendinopathy stuff pop up there as well because the tendons are at like maximal stretch almost because the bones have grown so quickly.
Yeah.
And that's where it's again important, like using isometric or slow contractions, like break down crosslinks and give the tendon more compliance, which intuitively is like, oh, that's going to ruin performance. Short term, improve performance, less pain, less injury risk, things like that. And then wait for these tissues to rematch the short term adaptation of like bone.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and this probably belongs in the other maybe the other talk, but like you said, the idea that these isometric holds are kind of breaking down, the crosslinks
Yeah.
and allowing the tendon to move. I think there's a big component of if we're focusing on, quote unquote tendon training, are
Mhm.
we emphasizing the health and the more compliance side of thing? I might be incorrect in, associating this, but I always associate the tendon compliance work with improving health
Yeah.
and well-being of the tendon. And then I associate your plyometric and your high intensity kind of high velocity activity with developing the stiffness and the performance aspect of the tendon. And we don't want to be probably too much in one and too much of the other. We want that balance of both because we need a tendon that is both compliant yet capable of being stiff and transmitting force when we need it to. So you talking about that kind of sparked that association that I have with, kind of tendon training for health and tendon training for performance because you go about them differently
Yeah.
because the tendon behaves differently in those under those conditions.
Yeah, I definitely agree because it's the scales, right? It's like the scales of judgment that you see. Like we don't want
Yeah.
them to be too far on either end. And I definitely think for us in the sectors we work in, high performance track and field, we are tipping the scales very much more in that performance realm of like, ooh, we're almost unhealthy. Like we're almost promoting injury to an extent because we're trying to push the envelope so far. So it's how much can we try to unweight that scale on the other end and keep things a little bit healthier without necessarily impacting performance negatively at the same time. Like it is that juggling act of how strong is strong enough. Like too much strength, you're dedicating too much energy away from what matters. Too little strength, you're just weak and fragile and broken and can't do anything very well. Like it's always that balancing act. And so I think the same goes with the tendon is how much tendon stiffness is good, how much tendon stiffness is going to create a muscle pull or tendinopathy issues or how much, tendon remodeling work is going to influence a healthy tendon, but then not take away from their ability to run or sprint or jump because now they're just too compliant and squishy and not stiff to do that activity.
Yeah, it's like trying to be a wet noodle and run. Like it's,
Yeah.
everything just um yeah, and again, it depends on the activity. We live in worlds where almost exclusively the training, like the sport specific technical training requires like minimal ground contact time, high velocities, like it's hard to go out and sprint 3 times a week and train for track and field or jump 3 times a week or something like that and not put a tremendous amount of stiffness stress on the
Yeah.
tendon, right? So you almost have to balance that out with, some of these longer duration isometric focused movements or things like you said that are going to elongate and break down the
Yeah.
the 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 jamming or the stiffness of the tendon, because so much of what we do in the sport creates stiffness and jamming up of the tendon, versus if you took somebody on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, like a power lifter,
Yeah.
right? Heavy strength movement, heavy strength loading, where longer ranges of motion, in substantially longer periods of time in which you're applying force, there's not a lot of stiffness and rebound activity, if anything. So, you go and do something like that with a power lifter, and you're just going to take something that's already very compliant and, you know, open, and just do even more of that. You almost want to do the opposite and kind of
Yeah.
help stiffen that up, because like you said, a tendon that's too stiff or too compliant, either one is going to have issues.
Yeah. When you see that in a lot of like Soviet weightlifter training, like the Soviet weightlifters, there's all kinds of black and gray video or black and white videos of juiced up Soviets doing plyos and hurdle hops and stair jumps and things like that, like
What's that
improving
one?
tendon
Is
stiffness.
What's the guy's name? Is it Werner? Is that the guy? The classic one where he like drops off the box and goes over all the hurdles and then flies up the flight of stairs. And it's like the 20-second
Oh,
long, like plyometric gauntlet.
he's got like kind of like curly-ish hair. Like he almost had a bit of like
Yeah.
a curly kind of fro type
Yeah.
thing going on. Yes. Yeah, I know which one they're talking about.
But
That
that's
guy's, and he's like
exactly
200
what you're
pounds.
like.
He's huge.
It looks like if, yeah, you're doing like plyos with like a thrower and you're like, no, 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 you can't jump over the hurdle. I'm not letting you go up the stairs. I'm going to leave
Yeah.
that for the 140-pound jumpers to do. But like you said, yeah, and that's a great point, because again, you're dealing with, you know, a sport that is creating a lot of tendon compliance, because if they're in there weightlifting
It's
every
all
day,
full range.
it's all full range, all tendon compliance. There's no stiffness. So it's interesting that they use that as the opposite, right? So
Well, then on the opposite space, I remember having this conversation with Cook when he was working with University of Alberta volleyball. So we're just talking about in-season training. I think classically, a lot of people see, oh, in-season training, you limit range of motion because you don't want to create excess fatigue from range of motion, like a lot of those kind of classic things. And he's like, oh, no, 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 no. We do all full range of motion during the season because like they live in 9 degrees of knee flexion above playing volleyball, and they're doing 120 to 200 jumps a day. He's like, I don't need more of that. I want less of that. We're gonna do the full range compliant, full knee range of motion stuff. So like it exists on the other end as well, where it's like, hey, if we live in this bouncy elastic space, we need to get out of that a bit to keep things healthy and moving well.
yeah, and I mean, that was one of the first things when like I started thinking about
Yeah.
tendon, I'll call it tendon training. I mean, it's much more than just tendon training. But I call it tendon training because I think the fixation, the focus is on the tendon. I had the exact same conversation with Mike as well. As soon as you
Yeah.
said I had a conversation with Cook, I was like, oh, this is going to be the gold nugget of information that he provided me as well. Um, where, yeah, it's a little bit like you said, it's doing the opposite, and that's kind of become a little bit of the themes on some of the days where I'm
Yeah.
training. Where okay, we have a day where we focus on stiffness and reactivity, and then we have a day where we focus on kind of compliance and you know range or opening things up, and it pairs nicely with like kind of the world of track and field where you have your high nervous system demand days
Yeah.
and your low nervous system demand days. And on the high demand days where you're sprinting, you pair that with all the plyometric work and the things that require tendon stiffness. And then on the off days, you're using cycling or swimming or open flowing tempo running with the isometric holds and the compliant focus things. And it allows you a little bit like what that conversation I had with Cook was a little bit some of the influence of where I was
Yeah.
seeing this tendon stiffness and compliance lining up well with some of the training days, and yeah, being able to take advantage of some of the, like I said, sort of the physiological and the neurological components of the tendon that we've been talking about.
Well, there's some interesting pieces of the nervous system being influenced by that. So there was a study that was done. I don't have the name right in front of me right now, but they essentially looked at rate of force development. So they didn't look into the tendons specifically as much. But they looked at exercise order and how it influenced rate of force development. So essentially, they had like just plyo, just slow strength. Then they had a group that did slow strength first, then plyo. Then a group
And
that
then a
did
group, yeah.
plyo first, then just strength. And the rate of force development actually got worse with like the classic order of exercises where it was plyo followed by strength. Whereas the group that did strength first and then plyo second had an increase in the rate of force development. I think they measured that through a 30-meter sprint
Okay.
and a counter movement jump. So what they're essentially saying is like your nervous system plasticity to the last thing you did will influence what happens after that. So if there's things to
Yeah,
be
and
happening after a session, it's like you should be popping and explosive and dynamic, not slow strength, things like that. So it will negatively influence.
that goes back to the point you were making earlier about the different like windows of time and different adaptations that you get. There's things that you could probably take advantage of a week later. There's things that you could take advantage of 30 seconds afterwards when you do stuff. Because again, like I'm going back to the more we've looked into the tendon, the more I've looked into the tendon, the more connections I've made to all the fascial and the anatomy trains
Yeah.
type stuff, where again, you have these different windows of time in which adaptations occur. And that's an example of something that, like you said, is almost instant. And it's probably a neural
Yeah.
change where like a heavy movement, there's a lot of force. The GTO shut down a little bit and go, okay, yeah, we're cool with this. And then you're like, okay, now's my time to come back and hit something with a tremendous amount of velocity now that the limiter has been
Yeah.
removed or the governor's gone. It's like, all right, now I can really let it rip. So again, these are things that I think, yeah, I probably could have implemented some of this tendon training stuff and
Yeah.
just, oh yeah, I'm told I need to do this and I do that and I just put it in there. But you really have a greater appreciation and understanding of how to manipulate some of these things when you,
Yeah.
again, are we going to go out and research tendons and do, you know, groundbreaking studies? No, but we probably now have a better understanding of some of the physiology and the, the neurological function of how the tendons are working behind the scenes to better kind of modulate what we're doing in training.
Well, yeah, and like this provides the context to really what we're going to talk about. Part two is how
Yes.
do some of these components influence the structures and the components and where bits and pieces are organized throughout the week. And you've already touched on that a little bit, but this provides the physiological underpinning to why we do what we do in the actual nuts and bolts of training, week to week, day to day, session to session, hour to hour, things like that.
Yeah. And again, I feel like I keep going back to this, you know, now that we're doing this tendon one, again, I'm constantly thinking back to the fascial series that we did because so much of this is
Yeah.
intertwined. I'm sure if we did it the opposite, it would be the same way. You talk about
Hmm.
the fascial system, you'd keep going back to the tendons. But even like, we talked about some of the time in which things happen, you
Yeah.
know, like I was really fascinated with the fascial training episode or the series we did when we were looking into some of the nutritional things and how much the
Mm.
nutritional component has an impact on the fascial system, where whether you're hydrated versus dehydrated, and
Yeah.
that can have almost an instant change. And you're talking about previously the diabetic things and the sugar links.
Yeah.
can create cross bridging within the tendons. And so, I haven't really referenced Keith Barr much, but he has a number of great uh, guest episodes where he's, on
Yeah.
podcasts and people have brought him in to talk. And some of the stuff that I've actually found the most interesting from him is when he's talking about the nutritional component of
Yeah.
of the tendon training, and like where with I can't remember if it was Keith Barr that talked about this or if it was one of the papers, but you see these leucine rich proteins within
Yeah.
very, very healthy, high functioning tendons. And then
Yeah.
with age, we see a decrease in those leucine rich proteins within the
Yeah.
tendon. So makes you start thinking, okay, is some sort of leucine supplement helpful if you are someone who's looking to get the most out of the tendons, or if you're someone who is perhaps dealing with a tendon rehab scenario, where
Yeah.
is that a helpful supplement to take in? Maybe, maybe not, but it was an interesting consideration. And I know for a fact this was Keith Barr, I think with Joel Smith on the Just Fly podcast,
Oh
one of the
yeah.
episodes he did where he was talking about the collagen supplement paired with the vitamin C in order to help the collagen uptake. So I can't remember if he suggested to use it before or after,
I
where,
believe it was after, if I'm, because I'm picturing the study that I've seen of the vitamin C with the collagen. I believe that they
yeah,
did it after the intervention. They would take the vitamin C or the orange juice with collagen.
yeah. And I thought it was after as well, because if we go back to the point I was talking about before from, I forget which paper, I think the Zabrinsky or Zabransky one, where the
Yeah.
net effect of exercise improves collagen synthesis more than it breaks it down. And so you kind of supercharge that
Yeah.
where
Oh,
you
yeah.
have exercise and then, you've stressed the tendon. Collagen synthesis is up 3 times. Collagen breakdown is, up less than that. So you have this window of opportunity where, again, I don't exactly know what the time frame is. Could you take it an hour later? Could you take it 5 hours later? Who knows? But once you've done exercise that creates this tendon breakdown and this collagen synthesis, you take the collagen supplement with the vitamin C and you can almost supercharge that effect, which again I thought was to me that was some of the most interesting things that Barr brought to the table when I was listening to
Yeah.
some of those podcasts, because I was expecting, oh, okay, I'm going to get some training ideas. I'm going to get
Mhm.
some new physiological or neurological components of the tendon, but I wasn't expecting to get sort of this like practical nutrition takeaway, which I mean, again, we're strength coaches, um, you know, not certified dietitians or
Yeah.
nutritionists, whichever one is the legit one, and there's the one that's the Mickey
I think
Mouse role that
dietitian
anyone,
is the certified body one.
yeah,
Dietitian would be the one.
and nutritionist is the Mickey Mouse operation where you can just
Yeah.
call yourself that. Um, so I don't like to give nutrition advice as a strength coach or a track coach, because to me
Yeah.
those certifications, it falls outside that realm. But to like tell somebody, yeah, okay, try this collagen supplement and
Yeah.
have some with your shake after a session. Like as long as it's coming from if you, hey, look for the NSC or the
Yeah.
NSF label or whatever. I mean, if you really want to do it right, you just make your own bone broth, and then there's no risk of that becoming contaminated unless you bought a, you know, HGH steroid contaminated animal that you got the bones from.
Well, what
Uh,
was it about? I know there's a thing for a while about Mexican pork with like testosterone in it or something like that, and people were
oh
like
yeah, the
testing positive.
beef, the
That
beef,
was
yeah,
as long as they're not pork bones, you're fine. Yeah, like
yeah,
you're
exactly. So, but I mean, that's a relatively. I think I'd be comfortable. I've never actually prescribed this to anybody, but I think I'd be comfortable saying like, hey, look for a good, like
yeah,
a reputable collagen supplement, or look for, hey, if you like to be in the kitchen, make your own bone broth. I've done it before. It's actually relatively easy to do.
if you buy
Because then
any
I'd be
rotisserie chicken type thing from a grocery store, it's super simple that way, right? Like you just do it the
that,
exact
that's
same
how I
way.
do it. That's how I
Yeah,
do it. Those are the cheapest chickens to buy. You buy those, and instead of tossing the bones, you make a broth out of it.
yeah,
And for $15 worth of chicken, I've got 2 weeks worth of meals.
Yeah.
So yeah, like that was a really cool thing that I learned from Bar that I hadn't even thought about the nutritional side of it.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the bone broth thing, 'cause I remember it was a Barbell Shrugged podcast episode with Cal Dietz when he was talking about triphasic.
Oh, you want to talk about some wild ideas? Cal Dietz has done and tried everything.
Yeah. But he said the same, and this was before all the collagen studies with Keith Barr. Like this was way before. He's like, "Oh yeah, during our eccentric and isometric phases, it's like I tell the athletes, drink lots of bone broth, do lots of soup stuff." Like that's what he would say similar things around the tendon. So I think it's one of those things that intuitively people have had inklings about for a while now. Because I think that podcast episode is probably 6 years old now, 5 years old now. Back when
And I
triphasic was
mean,
booming.
yeah, and really, if you think about it, we talked about, before we were recording, what's old is new. I mean, great grandmama was probably making bone broth, whatever, with, you know, stuff they had kicking around on the old farm or the old house, you
Yeah,
know, centuries ago. And that was something we got away from because, it takes 12 to 14 hours of simmering and boiling that to make. But,
yeah,
200 years ago, you used everything you had because you didn't know where stuff was coming from. So that to me sounds like a long lost, kind of method where people would have drank bone broth all the time because you didn't waste anything from an animal. And now we're just like, I only want this bit from the animal.
yeah.
Don't need the rest of it. So it's a bit of like a what's old is new, I think, in that
Yeah.
case.
Well, you sort of see like the old like not snake medicine salesman, but like the old sort of like myths or stories of like a whole like my grandma would make this thing and it was like made them so youthful and made them so strong and
Yeah. And if it's bone broth, there might be some rationale because they had this like anti-tendon aging that could have been going on.
that's the secret,
So
man. If you want to be that 70-year-old guy still slam dunking with elastic tendons, drink your
yeah,
bone broth, kids.
so that's me. But it was a cool takeaway because I find sometimes the nutritional stuff goes way over my head. Where they're
Yeah,
talking about like, you need blood work, you need this, you need that, and you're like, man, this ain't practical.
it
But this
exits out our
idea of like
scope.
exactly, but this, when Keith Barr was like, yeah, yeah, take some collagen and make sure you have some vitamin C with it because that'll help absorb it,
Yeah,
and then you're thinking, well, yeah, if I do things for the tendon, it breaks it down, collagen synthesis is up. Let me take some collagen and some vitamin C. You almost have nothing to lose. Some of these people may
it's
be taking a vitamin C tablet every day to, boost their
yeah,
immunity or something like that. So you may not even be making a radical alteration to their diet, but it
yeah.
could have some really good outputs or some really good like benefits in the end.
Well, like you said, there's the thing about this that I enjoy from like a strength conditioning coach perspective of like we have athletes who get drug tested. There's alternatives that aren't supplementary that makes it really easy. So yeah, drink some bone broth and have a glass of orange juice. No different like protein if you're doing hypertrophy training. It's like, hey, go eat a steak or go eat a bunch of chicken or like whatever ends up being. Go eat some chickpeas if you're vegetarian or vegan. But like it's nice when there's nutritional information like that. That's very simple,
Yeah.
very digestible, and very applicable in multiple different ways versus, hey, you got to go buy this $100 supplement at whatever and make sure it's not full of contamination. Like that's a nice piece to have with that.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, to me, that was one of the more unexpected kind
Yeah.
of, I think things that I think you described it really well. This is an episode that deals with the underpinnings
Yeah.
of tendon training. I think that was, yeah, I wasn't expecting to find that. So
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of slide that in somewhere in this episode in case people want to go out and make their own bone broth now and be super tendon creatures running around with all kinds of spring and bounce in their step.
Does Speed Streak Performance got to make a super end now? Is that what you're hinting at?
I mean, I make bone broth every week, so I mean, if we want to just brand it that, I mean, we could. I could post about it every week, be like, "Here's my soup, here's my bone broth." So, I mean, it's like I said, it's really easy to do.
Yeah.
And so it's Sunday when I'm at home and Formula One's on in the morning and the NASCAR's in the afternoon and IndyCar's on a little later in the day. And I'm just, been absorbed into my couch watching all this stuff. It's just simmering away on the
Bone brews on the
stovetop.
stove.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's easy to make.
There you go. I don't really have much else in terms of like physiology of tendons and stuff. Do you have anything else kind of last minute bits and pieces?
No, I mean, if I start talking about something else, I'm gonna go, on a ramble where it starts talking about the actual
No,
training, which we'll try to,
we can
you know,
shelf that for next episode.
save for next time. Because I'm sure the viewers are dying to know about your Mickey Mouse music.
Yes, to say,
They've been
speaking of
hanging on the
Mickey
whole
Mouse
time going,
operations,
get this tendon nonsense out of the way. I don't care about stiffness and compliance and physiological underpinnings of tendons. I need to know what the Mickey Mouse music was from Christian.
so I mean, what comes to mind when you think of Mickey Mouse music, Tommy?
Well, I mean, now that we've talked, I feel like it's my view's been influenced, but the like kind of the circus clown meme music, like when something's happening, I think it's from like the Three Stooges or whatever, but it's like an old the song, like the music rhythm is probably like 100 years old. But you know what I'm talking about, like that old
Kind of like
timey,
Midway
like
music? Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, like the like, and you see
Oh yeah, I
somebody
see what
like
you're saying.
it, and they have like somebody falling off a bike in fast motion or whatever. Like now because I'm associating Mickey Mouse with being this absolute like clown.
Clown.
When you say Mickey Mouse music, I'm thinking of like, something like that, which I
No, so
don't
this
imagine
is
you were listening to.
not at all. We're very far off where we're going.
Okay.
Probably the
I
opposite of
figured I
where we're
was.
going. So I live under a rock when it comes to music. Like I'm not, people have a pulse. I'm like, oh, this person's coming out with this new song or this person's coming with this new album. Like some people just have a really good pulse for that. I don't. I will
Well, do you not
discover a
check
new
your
album.
like followed artists on Spotify to see what they're doing? Like that's how I keep track of, oh, so and so is releasing an album, and then I know I got to make time in my listening.
I didn't even know I could follow an artist on Spotify. So that just tells you how.
What? Okay, no, continue. We're gonna go off the rails with this.
So like we talked about last week, I've been doing a lot of the trance house stuff because I've been
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
a lot of running, and that keeps me in one nice rhythm and nice flow when I'm running, just like smooth trance. So I went like, oh, who's got some great smooth trance jams? Deadmau 5, or Dead Mouse as some people would call him. So I went to my Apple Music, pulled up Dead Mouse, like, oh, let's just make like a Dead Mouse playlist. Didn't realize he came out with a new album this year.
Oh, I didn't know that either, to be honest.
So it came out in March. So I'm not too far off the bandwagon. But the
Okay.
album came out in March. Some great tunes. He's got quite a few with Cascade or Cascada. I don't know how you pronounce the name.
I've always said Cascade, but it
Okay.
could be like the whole Dead Mouse 5 thing. Who knows?
So he's got a
Which,
couple,
for
like,
the
there's, I
record,
think,
we know it's Dead Mouse, by the way. Just for the record, for everyone listening, we joke about Dead Mouse 5. We know it's Dead Mouse. So don't add us.
the story from that is when I was living in the States, my American friends thought it was Deadmau 5. That's how they said it. That's why it's Deadmau 5. But back to the Mickey Mouse thing. I don't know if you knew this. Deadmau5 was sued by Disney like a decade ago
Oh, I
over
didn't know that.
copyright over Mickey Mouse. They were saying like the mouse head that he wears
Had
is a copyright of Mickey Mouse because the silhouette looks similar enough. And it was like a whole lawsuit, like a multi-million-dollar lawsuit of
what's
Disney
funny
over
is
Deadmau 5.
he was in a lawsuit with Ferrari as well, I'm pretty sure.
Really? Over
Because
what?
Ferrari has like very stringent contractual agreements from what I understand about alteration of their vehicles. And he at one point, I think it was a Ferrari 458, and he wrapped it in like a bright neon color, and then he put, the Pop Tart Nyan Cat or Nyan Cat, or I don't know how you pronounce it.
No, he didn't.
Yeah, and he put it on the car, something like that. And Ferrari there was a lawsuit around like what's the word I'm looking for? Like, he defiled the car basically and had
It
ruined
would
this
go against
contractual
contract
agreement.
of what? Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know the exact details. Donut Media did a little story on it, so you'd have to go
Okay.
watch um, that like 10-minute episode. But yeah, so apparently, I guess that's not the first time. Yeah, he's
Dead Mouse is
stirring all
pissing off
kinds of
Walt
pots.
Disney and messing with Ferrari.
Apparently, yeah. Go after all the big corps. Just go do it. Yeah, that's not where I was expecting that to go. I wasn't even
Yeah.
thinking Dead Mouse, which
No, that's what I was chuckling to
I
myself
should
because
have
you're talking
because
Mickey Mouse. I'm like, oh man, Dead Mouse got sued by.
That actually lines up perfect. And this is why we do the intro live. Like there's just
Yeah.
surprise
Oh yeah.
because you never know what you're getting. You never know. So
Which I don't know how you draw that connection to. I remember reading that article about the lawsuit. I was like it's a mouse. I get it. Like Disney doesn't own every mouse, do they?
hey, don't mess with the mouse.
Don't
That's a phrase that I heard before. Heard that when I was in Orlando. Don't mess with the mouse.
mess with the mouse. See
So
y'all. All right, what's been happening in the
let's
gym for you, Tommy, these days? What's the new tunage?
well, so I toned it down a little bit. I talked last week about, Meshuggah, who are, it's heavy, it's good.
It's
Um,
pretty heavy.
th- this is a song I don't actually know when I first heard it. It's not a particularly great song, and I don't know anything else by the artist. The song is called "Burn the Witch" by the Stone Gods. It's it sounds like it's like a hard rock song. It sounds like it would be like one of the edgier tunes on like Tony Hawk Pro Skater. Like
Kind of like a
so
mother
it's
mother type tune level hard.
a little heavier.
Okay.
So I wouldn't describe it as metal. It's like hard rock, but it's not like, you know,
Yeah.
not everyone's gonna like it. Like I said, not a particularly great song. For whatever reason, I just like it. Like
Yeah.
I heard it, I liked it, and every like 3 or 4 years, I kind of get this like thing that pops in my head. It's like you haven't listened to that song in like 3 or 4 years, and I'm like, oh, I got to pull it up. And so I was listening to that, but then I don't know if you're also aware there is a song with the identical title, "Burn the Witch," by a much more popular band, which has Stone in the band name, and that's "Burn the Witch" by Queens of the Stone Age. So every time you
Oh
go to
yeah.
try to find "Burn the Witch" by the Stone Gods, you get the "Did you mean Burn the Witch" by Queens of the Stone Age. So then that led me down a massive Queens of the Stone Age rabbit hole where I was like, okay, I'll listen to all the good stuff that they have. So I went from, kind of the Meshuggah last week to I was like, okay, let me bring something that's a little more toned down for people to
Yeah.
to listen to. And then it turned into like a pop rock rabbit hole where then I was
Yeah.
just going and listening to all the, you know, radio banger hits from Queens of the Stone Age. So that's where I was this week music wise.
Queen of the Stone Age is a good one. They're a
Unexpectedly,
band I always forget about. Always forget about those guys, but they're great.
but then you know every song, like every
Yeah.
song, because
Oh
I
yeah.
was like, oh, I know all the words to this. I've heard this before.
Yeah.
So
No, they're a
that
great
was an
band.
unexpected kind of musical journey I went on this week. But yeah, always good. I like the Queens of the Stone Age. They're catchy.
Oh yeah.
They're not heavy. They're not metal, but they're good. So
They're a band you can whip out at any location and any situation, and people are for it. Like they're like, oh yeah, let's go. This is
oh
sick.
yeah, Queens of the Stone Age. Dave Grohl was in that band.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, good. Yeah,
Big
all
Dave
right,
Grohl
yeah, we'll
guy.
play this. Yeah, we'll play this. So yeah, that was my unexpected musical adventure this week.
Beautiful. Love it. All right. Well,
So
now I think we're gonna go off and listen to Queens of the Stone Age here and get my workout in.
yeah, why not? I mean, that's probably you can listen to the other song too if you end up finding it, but
Yeah.
the Queens of the Stone Age will probably be the most popular search. Um, but yeah, that was a good one. I enjoyed. I mean, again, the tendon training to me is also like it's just a lot of fun. So I
Yeah.
think a fun episode to kind of lay down kind of the boring stuff. I'll call it like you said,
Yeah.
the underpinnings of the tendon, and really kind of looking forward to talking about like the fun stuff that we actually do in the weight room and in training with the athletes to get this stuff to happen.
Yeah. I'm excited to get into part two here where we start talking about like the meat and potatoes of tendon training and what it actually looks like in application, then how do we structure it throughout the week depending on healthy, injured performance, whomever we've got in front of us there. So that'll be good to get into. I'm
Exactly.
excited for the part two.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. So hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Everyone listening, hopefully you learned something the same way we did when we were going through a bunch of the stuff. Um, and we'll be back with a part two with hopefully more practical takeaways. That's a little bit more fun. But thank you for listening. Thank you for watching whatever it is by the means that you take this in. Appreciate all the support. Appreciate everybody who's coming along for the ride with us. And yeah, looking forward to part two, and we'll see you for the next one.
All right. Take care, everyone.